Is a reading that seems topical to now with the times that we're living in with COVID, by a good friend of mine, Michael Kelly. He has been a friend for many years. We first met in the 80s and we've discovered all kinds of different things throughout the years together. But on this occasion, these are some of his more straightforward writings. I'll be doing some of his stories later. The first two, The Plague Doctor and All Fall Down, come from a short book written to accompany his magic shows, called Ghost Stories. And the final one comes from a book called The Haunters of the Dark, which is, and they all are on the theme of the plague and pestilence. The Plague Doctor by Michael Kelly. Sometimes an event can be a haunting instead of just an individual ghost. Sometimes an event in history is so terrible that it leaves psychic echoes down to the present day. The cry of a chorus of wretched souls reliving their misery. Such events are great natural disasters such as earthquakes or fires in which large numbers of people perish. The sites of such incidences can remain haunted for centuries afterwards. Not just by individual ghosts, but by the horror and the memory of the event itself. Sometimes these events are man-made. We are all aware of the stories of haunted battlefields, where the sound of charging horses, battle cries, and the screams of the slaughtered, the roar of cannons, may be heard on nights when the atmospheric conditions are just right to recreate the emotion of the conflict. One event occurred in the middle of the 14th century, which scarred the soul of Eurasia and Europe for centuries afterwards. A hideous and lethal new disease, which swept across Europe from the east, spreading relentlessly until every corner of the map was touched, and nearly half the population of Europe was dead, the Black Death. This loathsome and lethal disease became endemic in Europe and Britain, returning with new ferocity approximately every 20 years, in fresh outbreaks over the following centuries. There was not a family untouched by it. During the later visitations of the plague, doctors had become wise to the best methods to prevent its transmission, so they could examine and treat patients without running an unacceptable risk of infection themselves. Thus evolved the eerie and sinister-looking plague doctor outfits. The physician would be covered from head to toe in heavy garments. Large leather boots and thick leather gloves were worn, together with a heavy jerkin and trousers. Over this they wore a heavy floor-length waxed coat. Their head was covered in a full face mask with glass windows for them to see out of. The front of the mask was elongated like a bird's beak and was stuffed with aromatic herbs, which were presumed to dispel the mephitic miasma, the vapours that were at the time thought to be responsible for the spread of the plague. A broad-brimmed hat completed the ensemble, together with a long rod for prodding and handling the patient, and testing the hardness and resilience of their buboes. Although they did not know the true ways in which the plague spread, which was mainly through flea bites, passing on infected blood to new hosts, and to a lesser degree by physical contact with infected tissue, the plague doctor's outfit proved very successful in protecting its owner. The heavy leather coverings and wax surface prevented fleas from passing from the infected to the doctor, and ensured that contagious secretions were not touched. The more dangerously contagious pneumonic variant of the plague, which would often appear as an epidemic, reached its height and was also guarded against, with the mask helping to prevent the transmission of airborne droplets. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that the plague doctor was a nightmarish figure to behold, resembling a spectral bird. But of course the ministrations of the plague doctor were the sole slim hope sufferers from a disease had to hope for. Without treatment they would die. With treatment they would probably die, but there was at least a chance. The methods of the plague doctor were crude, administering ineffectual concoctions. But they would also wash the patient's inflamed lymph nodes, where the swollen buboes formed with cold water and would try to lance the swellings or apply leeches to them. And sometimes, by luck more than judgment, if the doctor purged enough of the infected blood from a swollen sore before it became too hard to cut, and if the sores were cleaned thoroughly enough, it might just buy the patient enough time for their immune system to fight back against the disease, if they had been treated in time and their constitution was strong enough to endure the sickness. So the plague doctor was a slim chance, and only a small percentage of their patients survived. But a slim chance is better than no chance at all. In a world where the dead were being collected from houses in every street, where people went to bed seemingly healthy but never woke up, where young and old alike fell indiscriminately on all sides, and the pestilence seemed unstoppable, would you be fortunate enough to receive a visit from the plague doctor, or would the barrow bear another gruesome burden to the lime pits? And in case you don't know about the look of the plague doctor, here's his costume. Continuing to all fall down. Ring around the roses, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, all fall down. This famous rhyme has long been said to refer to the Black Death, or more specifically to the Great Plague of London. The Great Plague was the most dreadful of the disease's later visitations upon the city of London, occurring in 1665. It swept through the dirty, tightly packed alleys and streets, killing a quarter of the city's inhabitants as it went, spreading far out into the surrounding countryside as far as Oxford and Derbyshire, carried by those fleeing from the pestilential city. But if it was one of the most terrible, it was also the last epidemic of the plague to afflict the British Isles. No one knows why. Some credit the Great Fire of London the following year with wiping it out, but the plague had already mostly passed by then. Nor did it linger in little pockets to spread again as it always had in the past. Its disappearance is a mystery, but amidst all the horror, there are many eerie mysteries concerning this particular outbreak of the plague, as we shall discover. The Ring Around the Roses rhyme, which appears at the beginning of this chapter, is often believed to refer to the Great Plague of London. The Ring of Roses is taken to refer to the buboes which swelled upon the bodies of the afflicted, surrounded by purplish black marks, the plague tokens, caused by hemorrhaging beneath the skin. The pocketful of posies refers to the nosegays of flowers that those who had to venture outdoors would hold under their nose, or the scented herbs with which the plague doctors filled their beaked masks, intended to drive away the disease miasma which was believed to facilitate the spread of a disease at the time. Ashes, ashes refers to the disposal of bodies in mass pit graves, with quicklime cast all over them to consume the infected flesh to try to halt the contagion. All fall down speaks for itself, the deadly toll of the illness. All very grim, but probably not strictly true. As many scholars have pointed out, the first records of the verse date back no earlier than 50 years after the Great Plague of 1665, so they assert there can be no direct connection. But 50 years after the plague saw another distinct event, and one which does seem to be perfectly timed to link the nursery rhyme with the plague. This was the publication of Daniel Defoe's classic novel relating the terror of that period, A Journal of the Plague Year. Journal of the Plague Year was written at the same time that Ring Around the Roses rhyme makes its first appearance, and as we shall see, there seem to be many eerie, indeed downright macabre, resonances between the two. It is now considered feasible that the rhyme came into common use not at the time of the Great Plague itself, but as a consequence of this printed account which so perfectly describes that hideous time. The version of the rhyme given at the head of this chapter is its original form, the one found in the earliest records of it. It is also the version of the rhyme which is still known in America today. Knowledge of the rhyme was taken to America with the settlers from Britain, but there it has simply been recorded in books of nursery rhymes and left unchanged. In Britain it continued to be used in children's games over the centuries and gradually underwent changes, such as the change from ashes to a tissue. But it is the original form of the rhyme, contemporaneous with the publication of Defoe's book, which has a horrible harmony with it, and seems to be the first edition of the book which it most clearly resonates with. Try to imagine the horror of living in plague-ridden London in the 17th century. trapped in its stinking alleys as a quarter of a city's population dies around you, struggling to keep yourself provisioned and fed, whilst avoiding the potentially infected crowds. You would have thought people would flee the city, and some did, and they tended to survive as a result, though they also spread the plague further afield. But the greater multitude did not. There were these curious blind spots in people's basic cognition. They seemed confused and dazed, sometimes seeing phantom dangers where there were none, and whilst failing to notice the very evidently real dangers around them. Some of this uncanny and frankly frightening disorientation and confusion seems to haunt the text of a Journal of the Plague Year and to ring mockingly through the nursery rhyme. The memory of bricks. You may have heard the stone tape theory as one possible explanation for certain kinds of haunting, most specifically those hauntings which revolve around a certain place where past events are replayed when conditions are right. The theory goes that when a highly emotional, traumatic event occurs, such as a terrible accident or murder, all of that emotional energy must go somewhere. It tends to be absorbed into the very stones of the house where the event happened. The bricks and mortar contain a large amount of silicon, which is of course widely used for recording and processing. When the circumstances are right, such as the same time of year or atmospheric conditions as the original event, the walls of the house play back the emotions that were recorded, along with visual or auditory cues. These are then picked up and witnessed by those who are sensitive to such things. Even those whose psychic sensitivity is not so acute may note a chilling atmosphere in such a place. It would be wrong to imagine that this theory explains all instances of hauntings, but it does have its merits, and I have one experience which seems to support it. A building whose very bricks held the inescapable, nerve-shredding memory of horror and anguish. Have you ever seen a pest house? One of the hospitals where victims of the Great Plague were incarcerated in 1665 to 1666 until they inevitably died. They received treatment there of a kind. Not that it did them much good, but the main purpose of such houses was to get them locked away from other people in a vain bid to halt the spread of the contagion. Hardly any now remain, and those that do have usually undergone desperate bids to disguise their history. But the pest house that I saw had long stood empty, its brickwork crumbling. Indeed, it was demolished soon afterwards. I did not enter, I dared not. My skin crawled to even look at it. The very appearance of the building screamed disease and wrongness. I looked shuddering at the mournful black holes of its windows from which horror bled like a sick river. The feeling of accumulated amplified misery and suffering that radiated out from that place is something that scarred me profoundly. So yes, buildings can remember the strong emotions that have been experienced within their walls. They can replay the suffering years and even centuries after those events occurred. Take my word for it. I strongly recommend you check out Michael Kelly and his Library of Doom and his magic shows. You won't be disappointed.
I will, Brian.